We like to believe that we can try and fully understand this universe, that we can read the patterns and therefore try to predict the future. What if I was to tell you though, that this universe we are a part of is way more random than we'd normally think it is, and that because of this randomness, our decision-making processes are extremely flawed. What is good, YouTube? My name is Ash Porter and it's so good to have you on the channel today. And honestly, today we are looking at an absolute stunning book. A book that I'm so glad I read and I cannot recommend enough. And that is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winning scholar, academic and writer. Let's just say he is incredibly clever and is devoted to his life to this work. And this book, what I think is really special about it, is it seems like it's almost a lifetime's worth of work put into a book. And it's not some academic book which only the smartest people in certain subject areas can read, but it's a really accessible read. Well, I say really accessible. It is accessible, but it's by no means easy. This book is all about looking at the way we make decisions and this idea that sometimes we make decisions fast based on intuition, and sometimes we make decisions through slow, purposeful deliberation. And he also applies a lot of this to the economic world in which he specialises. At times, if I'm being really honest, this book can be hard to follow. Mainly for me because I like economics, but I'm not really interested in it. What I was more interested in is the psychology, looking at the human brain and the way we think and make decisions. And also, like I said, this book is dense. It is so crammed full of high intellectual knowledge and stuff that he's literally devoted his life's work to, and it was well worth the time. I cannot recommend it enough, but I really had to be on my reading A game even to take in a fraction of what I was reading. Yet despite this kind of the difficulty of reading it, I don't really know, it is well worth your time. I honestly looked forward to every morning where I was sitting down to read this. I couldn't get enough of it. And if you are willing to push yourself, read this book. What I think is also incredible about this book is that it's one of those books, right, that you could probably read 10, 20 times and you wouldn't fully get everything in the book. You wouldn't be able to pick up everything and remember everything. There's just so much going on. Yet, with just one read, you can still learn and apply stuff to your life that could, to be honest, without exaggerating, be potentially life-changing. Imagine being able to get the best out of your decision-making processes. This really is an incredible book. Like I said, I loved it. I recommend it. If you want to get the most out of this book, go read it yourself. But for now, I'm going to share some of the things I learned. Guys, before we jump into the content, I just want to say I'm so enjoying my time on YouTube. I'm so enjoying making these videos, and I just, really appreciate it. If you haven't already, drop this video a like and subscribe to my channel. It just really helps me out. It makes me feel, all supported and all that. And I just really appreciate it as I'm on this journey to just 50 subscribers. So yeah, consider doing that. And anyway, let's jump on. Jump on? Let's carry on. The first thing which I took away, which is kind of the main theme of this book, is this idea of fast and slow thinking. And to break it down really easily, Kahneman is really kind, and he kind of creates these two ideas which in the brain, they don't actually exist. There isn't one part of the brain which does one function and another part does the other. However, to help us understand this concept, he comes up with this, and he just calls them System 1 and System 2. His definitions I'm going to read now. So System 1 operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. System 2 allocates attention to the effectual mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. So that is his words of how to describe these two ways of making decisions. From what I can understand, System 1 is like the fast thinking. It is almost that gut instinct, trusting your intuition and making those quick decisions. You know what it reminds me a lot of? It actually reminds me a lot of habits and the way our brain, to cut brain power and usage, it forms habits based on previous experience in similar situations. We can then automatically react to something. And I think this intuitive System 1 seems to be a similar thing when it comes to decision making. He also remarks how often the split of like our decisions, more often than not, we use System 1 to make a decision. System 2, however, is the slower part of it. It is the taking time to really think about something, using a lot of brain power to add up things. You know, even like a really great example is like complicated maths questions. Often, unless it's like really, really easy, you're going to be using your System 2 to sit there and really think about how to solve that problem. And it's the same when it comes to decision making. A pretty interesting statement he makes is that often people who are cognitively busy and using their System 2 a lot are more likely to be selfish, to use sexist language, and to make superficial judgments in social settings. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of meets the stereotype of like really clever people who are always like thinking about stuff or trying to be clever. They can often come across like that, and maybe that isn't a fair reflection of their personality. It's just the fact that so much is going on in their brain that it doesn't have time to think about how to be nice. Obviously that isn't a rule, it isn't 100% of the time, but I think it's an interesting observation. It's also something to be aware of, I guess, isn't it? That for any of us, that if we've got a lot going on, let's say, our brain feels like it's fully engaged, we're less likely to act in kind of socially acceptable or just kind ways. And so maybe that's a challenge for me to take away, that when there's a lot going on, when I've got a lot on my mind, I've got a lot of decisions to make, and it takes a lot of my brain power, I need to be aware of how I'm treating those around me. Maybe that's a challenge you can take away too. Though, to be honest, probably don't use my brain enough for it to be like a major problem, but I'm trying to be clever, you know. The next thing, which is like one of the big mind-blowing moments in this book for me, that like really made me question decision making, the world, and was a pretty eye-opening thing. It's that bit of information I used at the start of this video, that his research, or in his theory idea and a lot of other people's idea, is that the world is way more random than we think it is. Like, we like to try and see patterns and stuff, but often we try and find patterns where they just don't exist. And the result of this is that the way our intuitive System 1 works is it likes patterns. It likes to say, this has happened before, therefore it is likely to happen again, and so therefore I'm going to make my decision based on that previous experiences. However, if Kahneman is right and the world is way more random than we think, and patterns don't exist as often as they should, or we think they should, we can be prone to make intuitive decisions which will often be wrong because of the randomness. I feel like I said random about 50 times there, but I hope you get what I'm saying. He would even go as far to say that we are far too willing to reject the belief that much of what we see in life is random. And like, the more I've reflected on this, the more I've been like, you know what? He might be onto something, because life is just so full of variables, isn't it? There's so much that could go wrong, that could go right, that could change. Things like theories like, the butterfly effect, all this kind of stuff. There's so much chance in the world, and maybe, there is way more randomness to life than we think. And what I'm taking away from this is, one, obviously, the whole idea, maybe don't trust our instinct, our intuition as much. Maybe I personally need to take more time to think about stuff, to rationalize it, to really allow my system to work and to slow my decision making down. However, I also think there's this thing about how maybe the reason we try and find patterns and that we are rejecting of this idea of the randomness of the universe is that patterns and predictability allow us a bit of control. And to say randomness has such a huge proportion of effects in our lives, it takes away some of that control. And so I guess if Kahneman is right, there can be freedom found in this idea that life is random and that we don't have to predict everything. All right, the final thing I've learned, taken away. Now, you thought randomness was mind-blowing. You thought this idea that we have two ways of making decisions and we need to try and get a good balance between the two is mind-blowing. This final one, oh my days. So to start with, I'm going to use an example from the book. This isn't mine, this is Daniel Kahneman's example, but I think it illustrates this point just beautifully. So imagine, right, you're given two scenarios, and you have to work out which one is more likely to be true. And so example number one is a massive flood somewhere in North America next year in which more than 1,000 people drown. Then example number two, or option number two, is an earthquake in California sometime next year causing a flood in which more than 1,000 people drown. Which one is more likely? So, if you're like most people, now don't feel guilty about this, I can't remember if I fell for this one, but I'm going to say I did. But you will have said number two is more likely. You will have looked at it and thought, you know what? In my intuitive thought, California is on the west coast and that area is renowned for earthquakes, and so it could be an earthquake that causes a flood and people drown. And because of that extra bits of information in there, you feel like that is the more likely option. However, the trap there is that actually extra information within an event makes it less likely to happen. Adding those two extra pieces of information, firstly it being an earthquake which causes the flood, and then it being in California, statistically makes that scenario less likely to happen because it's under finer circumstances than the more general flood somewhere in North America. Scenario one, despite having less information, is actually the statistically more likely event. And if you got that right, I want to say, well done. And the likelihood is you're probably a more statistically inclined person and you're probably more of a slow thinker naturally. Whereas if you're more like me and you probably got that one wrong, or you were caught out, let's say, you're more inclined to use your faster System 1 intuitive decision-making method. And Kahneman describes this as the trap of detail. So in situation two, the idea is more fleshed out. You're able to visualize it better. It feels more tangibly real. And therefore, it becomes more persuasive and you're more likely to make that decision. However, the trap of detail is literally a trap because the more detail you add, statistically, the less likely that event is to happen. And this trap that we fall into leads us to having a seriously flawed decision-making process, and it also leaves us open, if we're not aware of it, to exploitation because of that. Just think about news people or governments or businesses. They will know this and they will be adding details to things where it just isn't needed to make things seem more likely to happen, to persuade you that their way is the right way, or this event is likely to happen, so buy this, or all this kind of stuff. This problem, this trap can be manipulated and used to exploit us. And so what I think I am taking away from this is that actually, yeah, statistically it makes no sense. I'd never really thought about that because I'm not a particularly statistically inclined person, but when it comes down to it, he's right. Detail doesn't mean something is more likely to happen. He's physically right in the way that statistically it means it's less likely to happen. That means for me, I know I need to stop trusting my instinct as much. Yes, my fast thinking can still be useful, but there are so many times where I probably need to slow down and really think about something, think out, is this statistically more probable? Therefore, how am I going to make this decision? And I'm telling you what, this is deep. Like this is one of those things which I said could potentially change your life if we can learn to understand this and put it into action in our lives. There you go. This is just a little bit of what I have learned from this book. Like I said before, to fully get the most out of this, go away and read it yourself. Hopefully I've given you a snippet, just a snippet of what this book is all about, and I so recommend you read it. I have been Ash Porter. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, I'll see you next time.